Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to talk about data annotation attributes. So on our models, we're able to add attributes to the properties of our classes to indicate what type of data that those properties should have in them. And this goes a bit more beyond just whether or not we want a string value or an integer. These are for things like if you want to have phone numbers, credit card information, or passwords. So here's a list of various attributes that are data annotation attributes you can add to the properties of your classes. The attribute name is pretty self-explanatory to what they do, except for a few exceptions, such as regular expression. But just to go down the list here real quickly, required means that the value for that particular property is required on that class. The display attribute is something we'll talk about when we get into views, but it essentially tells your views what the actual full name of that property should be. This is a way for you to actually allow spaces and alphanumeric text as the name that you're giving that particular property. Max length and min length are the maximum and minimum number of characters that must be in that property. The range attribute is for numerical ranges, and that can be singles, doubles, decimals, integers, any of the numeric data types. You can add a range attribute to specify what the smallest and largest numbers are that you're going to allow within that property. Regular expressions are a custom expression of validation characters, and you're going to want to take a look at the documentation to see how you put in a regular expression. But this can make it very easy for you to limit exactly how the data gets entered into the property. The compare attribute is really helpful because it allows you to compare the value of one property to the value of another property and make sure that they match. And this is especially helpful for like with passwords where you want to confirm the password twice. The data type attribute is another type of validation that will give you an enumerated list of data types. Now, I'm not going to go over the data type attribute and all of the different enumerated data types that you can have. It's a pretty lengthy list, so you're going to want to take a look at the documentation on how to use the data type attribute. The last three attributes, URL, phone, and credit card, are pretty self-explanatory. These do need to be on string properties, so URL, phone, and credit cards are all actually strings. And the URL, phone, or credit card attribute will verify or make sure that the data that is in that particular property matches either a URL, a phone, or a credit card number. Now, in most cases, these attributes, these data annotation attributes, are a way of performing validation. But also in some cases, they're a way of handing over information to the views. And we will talk about how that works when we discuss razor views later on in this series. But for right now, let's take a look at a simple example of how to use data annotations on our model classes so that we can specify what type of data we can put in our different properties of that class. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make the ID field a required value. So when the user goes to fill out the form, they're going to have to put in some sort of ID value. To do this, we're going to use the required attribute. Now, right now, we haven't brought in the namespace, so I'm going to go ahead and just move my cursor onto the required attribute and hit Control period, and that will show me that I can bring in the using statement of system component model.annotations. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that namespace in, or bring that using in, excuse me, and you can see that now it's acceptable to have my required attribute. Most data annotations you'll be working with on your POCO classes like this will be in this system.componentModel.data annotations namespace. But when we talk about Entity Framework, there will be some others because they will become very important to how data gets stored in the database. So the next thing I want to do is make a minimum and a maximum for first name and last name. So I'm going to go ahead and do a minimum, so min length, And in the min length attribute, you are going to use parentheses followed by an integer value to specify how big the minimum length is. And I'm just going to say 2. It looks like I misspelled length here, so let me just put the G there, and now it's accepting that min length data attribute. Okay, now I want to add a max length, so I'm going to go ahead and add another attribute here, so max length, and we're going to make it a max length of 50. That's pretty big. I don't think anybody's first name is really going to be bigger than 50, but who knows? Okay, so we have a min length and a max length data annotation attribute on the first name. And I've done it as 2 separate attributes, but there is another way that you can do this, and this is a really personal preference. You can also do, I'm going to do the same thing for last name here. I'm going to do a min length of 2 and a max length of 50, and you'll see that I'm just using a comma to separate the 2 attributes. And this is another way that you can do it. And a lot of people prefer this because it uses up less space. Some people prefer the double, having each individual attribute on there because it makes it easy to comment things out if you want to come back and just, test certain things as you're debugging. But really, it's entirely up to you how you want to do this. Now, in addition to the ID, first name, and last name, I'm also going to add a phone number. So I'm going to do a public string. We'll do a prop, and it's going to be a type of string, and it's going to be phone number. Oops, number. There we go. And I'm just going to use the attribute that comes provided to me with the MVC framework of just using a phone. So now that I have my attributes put on my contact, I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go to my form, and I'm going to need to add another input for that phone number. So let's go ahead and do that now. So now that we have our data annotations all set up on our model object, and we have our form ready to go that's going to submit the data to our controller, we can now go ahead and go to our controller and add the last bit of this. And what we need to do is we actually need to check to make sure that the data that is trying to be applied to this model is all valid. And we can do that by looking at the model state object and see if the property is valid, is true. So here in my index action that is receiving the HTTP post, the post method here, I'm going to go ahead and do if model state is valid. And the is valid is going to return a true or false Boolean that's going to say whether or not the values that were attempted to be put into the contact object were in fact validated properly against this contact object. And this is part of the model binding process. When the model binding occurs, it will set this is valid property to true or false depending upon how much of, whether or not there was an error in any one of these properties when it tried to bind to it. So let's go back to our controller, and now that we have our if is valid, now we can say, okay, if the data that was put into this contact model is valid, then we can go ahead and do this part of it. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out here, Control X, and then Control V. And now I need something, if that is not true, if the data was not valid, then I'm just going to do this. I'm going to just do a return of a view to the index with form. And you can, of course, go ahead and we could try to return the view model back, but I'm not going to do that just now. I'm just going to go ahead and return us back to the index with form. And that means that we're not going to see the page that tells us, hey, hi there, and based upon the information that we put in the form. Instead, it's just going to return us right back to the form. This is obviously not the ideal as far as what you want to present back to the user, but we will talk a lot more about validation messages and how to display errors to your users later on when we talk about razor views. But for right now, this will do fine. Just remember, if the model passes our model binding and does come in with an is valid, then they will get the regular view that actually says, hi there, and uses that name. If not, then it's just going to return them right back to the form. Let's go ahead and run this application and see what happens. So first we had ID as a required value. Let me go ahead and put in some data here for first name, last name, and phone number, but I'm not going to put any ID value in there, and I'm going to use valid data here. So we'll do Steve Bishop, and my phone number 555-555, oops, 5555. Okay, so that's a valid first name, that's a valid last name, and that is a phone number that is of the proper format. But we're leaving ID blank. And remember, the attribute that we had on here was saying that it was a required field here to have something in ID. So remember, if this does not work, which it shouldn't, then we should just be returned right back to the form. Let's go ahead and submit it. And we can see that we get returned right back to the form and all of the information we put in is blanked out. Now, if I put all this information back in, but I put in a valid ID, and we can just put the same information in here again and click submit, we should now get, hi there, Steve Bishop, your ID is 1, you work for the company. So we passed validation once we put that ID value in our form. Now the next thing that we had on here was the min length and the max length. So let's test that out. So we'll do just S, we'll just use my first initial, and we'll submit that. And again, we should get a failure here because the min length is 2 for the first name. And once again, we get returned back to a blank form. So let's go ahead and fix this. And this time, instead of doing S, I'll just do, let's say the little kitty came and sat on my keyboard here and put in a whole bunch of S's, and that's probably not valid information. And there we go. Same information, but now obviously our length is beyond 50. And if I click on submit, once again, we get a blank form indicating that we did not have a valid model being submitted. So it would work the same way for the last name as it did with the first name. If we had too few letters or too many letters in the last name, it would not accept it. So finally, let's test out the phone number. And I can leave the phone number blank. Remember, our model did not say that it was required to have a phone number, same as with the first name and last name. I could have left these things blank. And what would have happened here is that I just get, hi there blank, your ID is 1, you work for the company. Because the only field we said that was required was ID. But that's probably something we should go back and revisit and make our first and last names required too, if that was important to us. Now, the phone number again is not required, and if I leave that blank and submit it, it's going to accept that form. But if I put in some false information, so I'm just going to do, you can't have my phone number. That's obviously not a valid number. So if I click on submit, we get back to the form. So the data annotations that you put on your model objects, such as the required field, the min length, max length, and the things like phone, email, URL, that is a way for you to validate whether or not the data coming in is valid on the server. Now we haven't, like I said, we haven't talked about how to relay that there's a failure back to the user just yet, and we will talk about that when we get into Razor views. But for right now, this is at least going to give you the ability to have responsible data come into your database or into your system, wherever you're storing your data. and it will not corrupt the information. You won't be storing improper information, and you can ensure that the people are entering in the correct information. Now, one possibility just in the interim until we talk about views is that perhaps the return view could just simply be a view that says, you entered the wrong information, please click the back button and re-enter it. But typically, you're actually going to want to tell the user why there is a problem. And we will, like I said, talk about that. But anyway, so the data annotations on the properties, along with the controller checking the model state object to see if the isValid property is true, will tell us whether or not the data that was attempted to be model bound to this class is good or not. And based upon that, you can make your decision about which view do you want to redirect the user to. And in this case, if it was proper, then we directed them to the text that told them hello. If not, then it just returned them back to the form. So anyway, there you folks go. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me some comment, in the comments of this video below. And as always, if you did find this video useful, please don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate all of my viewers that I get. It really helps to continue to grow the channel, and makes me really want to keep making these videos so that you guys can learn more. So thank you again so much, and I hope you have a great day.